Catholic Church literally executed people for heating their homes this way. Not witchcraft, just staying warm. But here's what's insane. NASA engineers recently tested this exact method and called it thermodynamically perfect. So why did medieval authorities fear it enough to kill over it? The Romans figured out something brilliant. They built these underground heating systems called hypocosts, basically hollow spaces beneath their floors where hot air could circulate. Genius, right? Here's how it worked. You'd light a fire in a furnace outside the building. The hot air would travel through channels under raised stone floors, warming everything from below. Your feet stayed toasty. The whole room stayed comfortable. No smoke inside. And the efficiency? A single hypocost furnace could keep floor temperatures around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, even when it was freezing outside. That's warmer than most people keep their homes today. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval authorities knew about this technology. They had access to Roman blueprints, ruins they could study, even working examples in old bathhouses. Yet they rarely built new ones. Why? Because hypocausts were considered too extravagant, too Roman, too pagan even. Meanwhile, monks who publicly preach simplicity and humble living, archaeologists have found evidence they secretly maintained hypocausts in their monasteries. They'd preach about the virtue of cold while warming their toes on heated stone floors. Classic. Modern engineers have run the numbers. Hypocausts were roughly 40% more fuel efficient than open fireplaces. You burn less wood, get more heat, and nobody's eyes water from smoke. Your radiant floor heating system today? Same exact principle. Just swap the smoke for water pipes or electric mats. So we abandoned a superior technology for centuries because it seemed too fancy. But heated floors were just the beginning. What about heated beds? Now here's something your grandmother probably used, and honestly, she was ahead of her time. The bed-warming pan. Simple concept. Take a metal pan with a long handle, fill it with hot coals or embers, slide it between your sheets. Done. Within minutes, your bed goes from, I might die tonight, to actually comfortable. We're talking a 20 to 30 degree temperature jump in the exact spot where you're about to sleep. And the genius part? You're not wasting fuel heating an entire room. Just your bed. Just where it matters. I remember my aunt had one of these hanging on her wall as decoration. Turns out it wasn't decoration to her parents. It was survival equipment. Medieval authorities actually restricted these things, but not because they didn't work. Oh, they worked beautifully. The problem was fire hazard. Hot coals plus dry bedding plus sleepy people equals occasional disasters. Fair point, honestly. But here's what kills me. Modern electric blankets and heated mattress pads, same exact principle. We just swapped embers for electricity and called it innovation. The math made sense back then too. Why burn enough wood to heat a drafty stone room all night when a handful of coals could keep you warm until morning? Households using warming pans cut their wood consumption dramatically. Targeted, personal heating, no wasted energy. Our ancestors understood efficiency better than we give them credit for. But warming pans weren't the weirdest heat source medieval people exploited. Not even close. A single cow puts out as much heat as a 400-watt space heater running all night long. That's not folklore. That's thermodynamics. Medieval peasants figured this out centuries before anyone could measure it. They built longhouses where animals lived on one side and families lived on the other. Sometimes the sleeping quarters sat directly above the barn. Heat rises, right? Free warmth all winter. Authorities hated this. They called it dirty, uncivilized, even sinful. Separate yourselves from the beasts, the church insisted. But here's the thing, people who ignored that advice survived harsh winters far better than those who didn't. Thermal studies of reconstructed longhouses show interior temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than outside. No fire needed, just cows being cows, and the weird part is, we're circling back to the same logic today. Modern passive houses capture heat from all kinds of unexpected sources. Compost bins, server rooms, even human bodies in well-insulated buildings. My grandfather used to joke that his dairy barn was warmer than his house. Turns out he wasn't exaggerating. Those cows were essentially biological furnaces, converting hay into heat around the clock. The Vikings knew it. The Scots knew it. Basically, every culture that dealt with brutal winters figured out the same trick independently. But animals weren't the only living things producing free heat. Some medieval households discovered that the processes happening in their kitchens and brewhouses could warm entire rooms without burning a single extra log. Here's the thing about medieval doctors. They were terrified of bad air. Miasma, they called it. Breathing stale air at night, that would kill you faster than the plague, apparently. So when people started hanging thick curtains around their beds, authorities got nervous. All that trapped breath, dangerous, unhealthy, possibly sinful. Turns out they were completely wrong. A four-poster bed with heavy wool drapes wasn't just fancy decoration. It was a personal heating tent. Your body generates about 100 watts of heat while sleeping. Trap that warmth with curtains, and you've created a microclimate 25 degrees warmer than your freezing bedroom. That's the difference between shivering all night and actually resting. The really clever families didn't stop at one layer. They used multiple curtains, linen closest to the bed for breathability, wool in the middle for insulation, velvet on the outside because, well, why not look good while staying warm? Modern sleep scientists have confirmed what peasants figured out 8 centuries ago. Enclosed sleeping spaces help maintain body temperature and improve rest quality. The bad air fear? Complete nonsense. You'd need an airtight seal to run into oxygen problems, and medieval curtains had plenty of gaps. My grandmother had heavy curtains on her bed until the 1970s, called it old-fashioned. I called it her heating bill being suspiciously low, but curtains only work when you're in bed. What about the rest of your home? Some medieval builders went underground, literally, and the results were shocking. Here's the thing about medieval homes. The ones built partially underground were often the warmest, but good luck convincing anyone to live in one. Church authorities called them pagan. Nobles called them peasant hovels. Tax collectors couldn't figure out how to assess them, so people avoided building them even when they worked brilliantly. And brilliantly is the right word. Dig down just a few feet and the soil temperature stays around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. Doesn't matter if it's blazing summer or brutal winter, the earth holds steady. Vikings figured this out centuries ago with their pit houses. Icelandic families built turf homes that survived Arctic winters with fires so small you could cook a single pot of stew on them. The energy savings? Archaeologists estimate 70 to 80% compared to above-ground homes. That's not a typo. 80% less fuel while staying comfortable. Modern architects now call this earth birming or earth-sheltered design, and they charge premium prices for it. Same concept medieval peasants used for free. I visited an old underground storage cellar once in rural England. Middle of January, freezing rain outside and inside. Perfectly pleasant. No heating whatsoever, just smart building placement. The real genius wasn't the digging. It was understanding that nature already provides stable temperatures if you stop fighting against it. Why burn endless wood when the ground does the work? But speaking of using what's already around you, the next trick involves something medieval people literally breathed every single day. Here's the thing about chimneys. Everyone thinks they were this brilliant upgrade. But before they existed, people just let smoke hang out in the room like an unwanted house guest. Sounds terrible, right? Well, medieval folks weren't stupid. They noticed something important. Smoky rooms stayed 10 to 15 degrees warmer than rooms with chimneys that immediately vented all that hot air outside. See, when smoke fills a space, it heats every surface it touches. Walls, furniture, the ceiling, everything absorbs warmth and radiates it back. Install a chimney and whoosh, all that heat disappears up the flue like your paycheck on rent day. But wait, what about breathing? Good question. Here's the clever part. Fires were kept small, really small, and people stayed low, below the smoke layer. The warm air rose, carrying smoke with it, while cleaner air stayed near the floor where everyone actually lived. Plus, that smoke did double duty. It preserved wooden beams from rot, cured meat hanging from rafters, kept insects away. One fire, multiple benefits. Did it cause respiratory problems? Sometimes, yes, but medieval records show many of these households burned less wood overall. Smaller fires meant less smoke than you'd expect. Modern masonry stoves and heat recovery ventilators, they're basically trying to recapture what chimneys threw away. Engineers spend fortunes designing systems to keep heat inside while removing combustion gases. Medieval peasants figured this out by accident centuries ago. Now, speaking of heat sources nobody expected, there's one that came from monastery brewhouses. Here's where things get a little boozy. Fermenting beer, wine, or even sauerkraut inside your home was frowned upon by medieval authorities. The fumes were considered dangerous. Fire risk from all that alcohol? Very real. And honestly, the smell probably didn't win any popularity contests either. But here's what those rule makers missed completely. Fermentation produces heat. Serious heat. When yeast breaks down sugars, it releases energy. About 500 BTUs per gallon of actively fermenting liquid. Set up a few large vats in your home, and you've basically got a space heater that also makes beer. Monks figured this out quickly. They positioned their dormitories right next to the brewhouses. Officially, convenience. Unofficially, free warmth all winter long. Those clever brothers weren't just making ale, they were heating their beds. A decent-sized fermentation operation could raise room temperature by 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That's significant when you're trying to survive January without central heating. And the weird part is, modern craft brewers deal with the exact opposite problem. They spend money on cooling systems to keep fermentation temperatures down. All that heat has to go somewhere. Medieval peasants didn't have thermostats, but they understood cause and effect. You make beer, the room gets warmer. Why waste that? Double benefit. Triple, actually. You get alcohol, you get heat, and you get the warm, fuzzy feeling of outsmarting everyone who said you couldn't brew indoors. Speaking of capturing heat from everyday activities, wait until you see how simple brick ovens turned into all-day radiators. Masonry stoves might be the most underrated heating invention in history. Seriously. Here's how they worked. You'd build a quick hot fire inside a clay or brick stove. Burn it fast, maybe 30 minutes. Then let the fire die. And here's where the magic happened. Those thick walls absorbed all that heat and slowly released it over the next 12 to 24 hours. One fire in the morning, warm room until bedtime. That's it. Now compare that to an open fireplace, which basically acts like a heat vacuum. Most of that warmth shoots straight up the chimney. You're warming the sky. The birds are cozy. You're freezing. Masonry stoves, they used 1/3 the wood while producing more usable heat. I did the math once on my own wood consumption. Let's just say I felt personally attacked by medieval efficiency. The Russians perfected these. So did the Scandinavians. Makes sense, right? When your winters last 8 months, you figure things out fast. Modern EPA studies actually tested these old designs. Results? Far less pollution than open hearths, cleaner air, less fuel, more warmth. It's almost embarrassing how much better they were. The secret was thermal mass. Those heavy clay walls stored energy like a battery. Radiant heat came off them gently, evenly. No hot spots, no cold corners, just consistent warmth wrapping around you. And yet most of Europe stuck with smoky fireplaces for centuries. But storing heat in walls is just one approach. What about storing it in something you wear? Here's the thing about medieval heating that nobody talks about. The best heating system wasn't in your house. It was on your body. Sumptuary laws. Ever heard of them? These were actual regulations telling peasants what they could and couldn't wear. Fur was reserved for nobility. Ermine, sable, mink, all off limits for common folk. Not because of cost, but because looking warm was a status symbol. Meanwhile, nobles walked around in layered fur robes while everyone else froze. A full-length fur cloak could provide the equivalent warmth of raising room temperature by 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not an exaggeration. That's physics. And the clever ones figured out workarounds. Wool layers, linen underneath to wick moisture, heavy outer garments to trap air. Medieval workers weren't stupid. They understood that multiple thin layers beat one thick one. Same principle modern mountaineers use today. The real genius? Clothing requires zero fuel. No wood to chop, no fire to tend, no smoke to breathe. I've tested this myself during winter camping trips. 3 proper layers kept me warmer than my friend huddled next to a dying campfire. He spent the night feeding flames. I slept like a baby. Medieval sleepers wore caps to bed. Not for fashion, because you lose 30% of body heat through your head. Workers wrapped their legs in cloth strips before long shifts. Practical, portable warmth. Your body generates roughly 100 watts continuously. That's free heat, just waiting to be captured. But clothing wasn't the only portable heat source. Some people carried warmth with them in ways that seem almost dangerous today. Here's where medieval people got creative with chemistry. Heated stones were the original overnight warmers. You'd toss a good-sized rock into the fire, let it absorb heat for an hour, wrap it in cloth, and slip it under your blankets. 6 to 8 hours of steady warmth. No electricity, no batteries, just physics doing its thing. But not all stones worked equally well. Medieval folks figured out that soapstone held heat way longer than regular granite. They didn't know the science, that soapstone has higher thermal mass and releases energy more slowly, but they noticed the difference, and they shared that knowledge. That's early material science, people. Trial and error leading to genuine innovation. Now, the more adventurous types went further. Quicklime mixed with water creates an intense chemical reaction that generates serious heat. We're talking temperatures that could burn skin. Dangerous? Absolutely. Effective? Undeniably. Some brave souls used small amounts in containers to warm spaces. Others used it to heat water for bathing during winter. It was essentially a medieval chemical hand warmer, just way more likely to cause problems if you got careless. Modern hot water bottles and those little packets you squeeze and stuff in your gloves, same basic concept, just safer and more convenient. The cleverness here was understanding that you didn't need massive fires to stay warm. Small targeted heat sources placed strategically could do the job with far less risk and fuel. Speaking of smart building choices, medieval architects discovered something interesting about walls, specifically what happens when you double them. Here's something the tax collectors hated. Medieval builders figured out that if you constructed 2 walls with an air gap between them, you could cut heat loss by 40%. No extra fuel, no fancy materials, just empty space doing the heavy lifting. And that's exactly why authorities in some regions banned it. See, tax assessors measured wall thickness to determine property value. Double walls made homes look grander than they were. Sneaky, right? So officials cracked down, claiming it wasted materials or violated building codes. But the physics don't lie. Air is a terrible conductor of heat. That's why it works so well as insulation. A 4-inch gap between 2 stone walls creates a thermal barrier that keeps warmth inside, like a thermos keeps coffee hot. The monks at Canterbury Cathedral knew this. Their chapter house used double walls to maintain stable temperatures year-round, while everyone else froze in their single-walled chapels. Modern builders call this cavity wall construction. Your house probably has it right now. We just stuff the gap with foam or fiberglass instead of leaving it empty. But here's what gets me. These medieval masons understood thermal dynamics through trial and error. No thermometers, no engineering degrees, just observation and cleverness passed down through guilds. They built passive insulation systems that required 0 maintenance and 0 fuel. Meanwhile, I can't figure out my smart thermostat half the time. Speaking of clever thermal tricks, the next method turned large gatherings into something surprisingly useful. Here's the thing about medieval lords. They weren't just throwing parties for fun. They were running human-powered heating systems. Pack 50 people into a great hall, and you've got roughly 5,000 watts of body heat. That's like plugging in 5 space heaters, except these heaters also applaud your jokes and compliment your roast venison. Lords figured this out fast. Why burn extra firewood when your dinner guests are basically walking furnaces? The bigger the feast, the warmer the room. Suddenly, inviting your annoying cousin makes thermal sense. And it gets better. All that breathing adds moisture to the air. Humid air feels warmer than dry air at the same temperature. So a packed hall felt cozier without touching the hearth. Modern engineers actually calculate this stuff. Theaters, stadiums, concert venues, they all factor in occupancy heat loads when designing climate systems. Sometimes they need cooling because too many people show up. Medieval feast halls needed the opposite problem solved. The clever bit, this heat was completely renewable. People ate food, food became body heat warmed the room. It's basically a biological heating loop. My grandmother would have called it free money. And she wasn't wrong. Some historians think seating arrangements weren't just about social rank. They were about heat distribution. Put the important folks near the center where body heat concentrated. Stick the less important guests near drafty doors. Politics and thermodynamics, all wrapped into one dinner party. But using people as heaters wasn't the only sneaky trick happening overhead. Those blackened ceilings, they were working harder than anyone realized. Here's something nobody tells you about medieval ceilings. They were black, not painted black. coated in years of soot from cooking fires and torches, and everyone assumed this was just poor housekeeping. Dirty peasants living in dirty homes. Wrong. Those blackened ceilings were actually working overtime as heating systems. See, dark surfaces absorb heat incredibly well. They also radiate it back. So when fires burned below, all that heat rising up got absorbed by the soot layer, then it slowly released back down into the room, like a thermal battery hanging over your head. The physics here is genuinely clever. Light-colored surfaces reflect heat away, dark surfaces capture it. A soot-coated ceiling could absorb radiant energy from flames and glow it back for hours after the fire died down. Then the whitewashing trend hit. Authorities pushed for white ceilings, cleaner, brighter, more civilized. What nobody calculated was the thermal cost. Suddenly, all that precious heat bounced straight off those pretty white surfaces and disappeared into the rafters. Rooms that stayed warm became rooms that needed bigger fires. Modern engineers finally caught on. Radiant ceiling panels, same principle. Dark materials that absorb and release heat strategically. We literally reinvented what soot did for free. My grandmother's farmhouse still had those dark beams. I thought they were just old and grimy. Turns out, great-grandpa was running passive heating technology up there. But absorbing heat is one thing. What about trapping it in your food? Here's something your grandmother probably did without even knowing she was being an energy genius. Haybox cooking. Simple idea. You'd heat a pot of stew or porridge on the fire until it was boiling, then bury it in a box packed tight with hay or straw. The insulation trapped all that heat inside. Food kept cooking for hours without another stick of firewood. And the numbers? A hay box could reduce cooking fuel by 70%. 70. That's not a small trick. That's a revolution. But here's what most people miss. That slow cooking pot didn't just finish your dinner, it became a heat source itself. Families positioned these insulated boxes near sleeping areas. The warmth radiating from hours of trapped heat gently raised temperatures in cold corners of the home. Two benefits from one fire. Your mother-in-law would call that efficient. Scientists call it thermal retention optimization. Same thing, really. The medieval church didn't love this method, though. They worried about spoiled food causing illness. Fair concern, honestly. Get the temperature wrong, and you're growing bacteria instead of cooking beans. But done right, perfect results every time. Modern slow cookers operate on identical physics. We just plugged them in and made them idiot-proof. My own crock-pot has saved me from countless kitchen disasters. Set it and forget it, as they say. What's wild is how medieval people understood heat loss instinctively. No thermometers, no science classes, just observation and survival. But speaking of turning ordinary objects into warmth machines, the next trick transformed castle walls into something far more useful than decoration. Tapestries weren't just decoration. They were medieval insulation disguised as art. Here's what most people miss. Stone walls are basically ice blocks with delusions of grandeur. They absorb cold from outside and radiate it straight into your living space. Brutal in winter. So what did wealthy medieval households do? They hung massive wool tapestries, heavy ones, sometimes weighing over 50 pounds each. And the results? Stunning. Modern testing shows these textile wall coverings reduced heat loss by 30 to 40%. That's comparable to fiberglass insulation. Except fiberglass doesn't feature unicorns hunting deer. The trapped air between wool fibers and stone created a thermal barrier. Plus, tapestries blocked drafts sneaking through cracks in masonry. Two problems, one gorgeous solution. But here's the frustrating part. Sumptuary laws and heavy taxes made tapestries luxury items. Common folk couldn't legally own the good ones. Authorities basically taxed warmth. My grandmother had thick wool blankets covering every wall in her drafty farmhouse. Same principle. She called it practical decorating. I called it genius after spending winters there without freezing. The Bayeux Tapestry wasn't just historical propaganda. It was probably keeping some Norman lord's backside warm while he admired his ancestors' conquests. Now, monasteries got clever about this. They commissioned religious scenes specifically sized to cover the coldest walls. Devotion and comfort in one purchase. Monks understood efficiency. Speaking of clever spatial tricks, what if you could shrink your sleeping space down to something almost coffin-sized? Sounds cramped, but the heating benefits were remarkable. Ever seen those old box beds built into walls? They weren't just furniture. They were survival pods. These shuttered sleep nooks were basically closets you could sleep in. Wooden doors closed completely around you. And the genius was simple physics. Your body constantly produces heat, about 100 watts worth. In a massive bedroom, that heat disappears instantly into cold stone walls and drafty windows. Completely wasted. But in a space barely bigger than your body, that same heat accumulates, fast. Measurements from preserved examples show these nooks could maintain 65 degrees Fahrenheit while the main room dropped to 35. That's a 30-degree difference from doing absolutely nothing except closing some wooden doors. I once stayed in a reconstructed medieval cottage in Scotland. The main room felt like a refrigerator, but that little sleeping box, toasty. My own breath and body heat did all the work. No fire needed. The Bretons in France perfected these. Whole families had individual boxes along one wall. Parents in one, children stacked in another. Like human filing cabinets, except warmer. And here's what modern architects finally figured out. The principle scales beautifully. Japan's capsule hotels, same concept. Tiny sleeping spaces are dramatically easier to heat than entire rooms. Why waste energy warming air you're not even using? The medieval answer was elegant. Don't heat the room. Heat the person. Create boundaries around where warmth actually matters. Speaking of boundaries, what if the heat source wasn't inside your home at all, but rotting right next door? Here's where things get a little gross, but also brilliant. Compost piles, rotting vegetables, decomposing manure. Not exactly glamorous, right? Well, medieval farmers didn't care about glamour. They cared about not freezing to death. See, when organic matter breaks down, it generates serious heat. We're talking 130 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hotter than most hot tubs, and it keeps producing that heat for weeks, sometimes months. So what did clever peasants do? They built their homes right next to massive compost heaps. Some even constructed shared walls between living quarters and manure piles. Sounds disgusting. Worked beautifully. The heat radiating through those walls could raise indoor temperatures by 15 degrees or more. No wood burned, no fire tended, just rotting stuff doing its thing. Now, authorities absolutely hated this practice, called it unsanitary, said it attracted vermin, and honestly, they weren't wrong about the smell, but here's what they missed. These families stayed warm while their neighbors shivered. I actually tried small-scale composting near my shed once. Middle of January, steam was rising off that pile like it was a hot spring. Pretty wild to witness. Modern permaculture enthusiasts have rediscovered this trick. Compost-heated greenhouses now grow vegetables through brutal winters using zero electricity. Some innovative folks even run water pipes through their compost to create makeshift heating systems. Biological heat. Free, renewable, and endlessly available wherever there's organic waste. But medieval people found even stranger ways to store warmth, and the next method involves something you probably have in your kitchen right now. Salt bricks. Not for seasoning your food, for heating your bedroom. Medieval people figured out that large blocks of salt, when heated near a fire, could store warmth for 12 hours or more. That's an entire night of gentle heat radiating into your sleeping space from a single heated block. Why salt specifically? Salt has this incredible ability to absorb heat slowly and release it even slower. Regular stones cool down in a few hours. Salt keeps going like that one uncle who won't stop telling stories at family gatherings. And here's something clever. Salt also pulls moisture from the air. So these bricks weren't just heating bedrooms. They were dehumidifying them. Dry air feels warmer than damp air at the same temperature. Double benefit from one simple block. Monks placed heated salt bricks near their beds in monastery dormitories. Workers tucked them under benches. Some families passed down carved salt blocks for generations because good ones lasted decades. The wealthy had elaborate salt storage systems. Heat the bricks during dinner, move them to bed chambers before sleep, wake up warm without tending a fire all night. Now here's where it gets wild. Modern solar power plants, they store energy in molten salt. Same basic principle the medievals stumbled onto, just scaled up massively. Your local solar farm and a 13th century peasant's bedroom have something fundamental in common. Thermal mass works. Store heat when you have it. Release it when you need it. But salt wasn't the only overlooked insulator. Hay and straw were everywhere, basically free and shockingly effective. You know what's funny? The best insulation in medieval times was literally just dead plants, hay, and straw. That's it. Peasants stuffed this stuff everywhere. Walls, floors, mattresses, even packed it between ceiling boards. And authorities hated it because, well, it burns, obviously. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Straw works incredibly well, not despite being simple. Because it's simple. Each hollow stem traps tiny pockets of still air. And still air? That's nature's best insulator. Period. A wall stuffed with 12 inches of packed straw has an R value of around 28. For context, that beats most modern fiberglass installations. Medieval peasants accidentally invented something engineers took centuries to match. My grandfather used to say his family's farmhouse stayed warmer than the fancy stone manor down the road. Rich folks built cold, he'd laugh. He wasn't wrong. The fire risk was real, sure, but clever builders learned workarounds. They mixed clay with straw to make cob, plastered over exposed surfaces, kept flames away from bedding areas, and the cost? Basically nothing. After every harvest, farmers had mountains of straw left over. Why burn expensive wood when you could just trap the heat you already made? Modern straw bale houses are popping up everywhere now. They cost less to heat. They're sustainable. They're quiet. Architects act like they invented something revolutionary. Nope. Just rediscovered what peasants knew 800 years ago. But straw wasn't the only thing medieval builders pointed toward the sun. The next trick? It captured light itself. Here's the thing about medieval people. They weren't dumb. They were just working with what they had. And what they had? Sunlight. Free sunlight. So some clever folks built glass or oiled parchment lean-tos against their south-facing walls. Basically, a primitive greenhouse attached to their house. The sun would stream in, heat up that enclosed space, and warm the adjacent room by 10 to 15 degrees on a sunny winter day. No wood, no smoke, just physics. Now, glass was expensive back then. Really expensive. So most people used oiled parchment or animal membranes stretched over wooden frames. Not as clear, but still let light through. Still trapped heat. Monks figured this out early. They'd grow herbs year-round in these attached sun spaces while simultaneously heating their infirmaries. 2 birds, 1 stone, 0 fuel. The wild part? Modern passive solar design uses this exact concept. Architects call them sunrooms or attached sun spaces now. Charge you thousands for the design. Medieval peasants just called it common sense. Some families grew vegetables in these lean-tos during winter. Fresh food and free heat. My grandfather would have loved that kind of efficiency. He hated waste more than anything. Today's green building movement treats passive solar like some revolutionary discovery. It's not. It's ancient wisdom wrapped in new terminology. 20 heating tricks, 20 methods that worked, and every single one came from people who couldn't afford to waste resources. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Necessity doesn't just breed invention, it breeds genius.